Okay. Okay. Hi, everyone. Yeah, welcome to the podcast. And this is Bill, as always. Today, we're honored to have Inworld CEO, who is actually announcing a big upcoming announcement this Wednesday. So this podcast will go live on Wednesday when their like big announcement actually go out live. So without further ado, let's get him to like introduce himself and introduce everyone what Inward is about.
Great. Thank you, Bill. Appreciate it. And yeah, thanks everyone for tuning in. So Kylan, my background, I was at DeepMind before on the research side and then on the product side. Um, and I've always been kind of working in LLMs, generative AI. So Inworld is basically the company that builds the AI runtime for consumer applications. What that means is we build all the infrastructure layer that allows people who are building consumer-facing AI applications to be able to run those efficiently, to make the most engaging for users, and ultimately solve a lot of the challenges that are very specific to the consumer space. So we started 4 years ago now. My kind of background from DeepMind can kind of lead up to that story. So, you know, we started out trying to bring a lot of the early DeepMind models into Google products like search, YouTube, cloud, ads, and everything else. And we saw very quickly that a lot of it was flowing into enterprise applications rather than to consumer. And so, the founding team, my co-founders and I were inspired to say, how can we basically make sure that the benefits and magic of AI actually reach consumers at the end of the day? Because we've always believed that the most value and benefits of AI will accrue when they kind of touch everybody's daily lives and not necessarily just professional facing applications.
Yeah, this is so interesting. I think Inward has gone through a lot of very like big releases with Nvidia, with Microsoft, and has been one of the stars in like a gaming AI space over the last 2 years. And personally, I am a big like fan of like gaming. I have been kind of like playing when I was a child, and as now I get to startup, it's getting harder, but yeah, still I try to like constantly like buy out all the different game devices and test out how it experience and imagine how the future look like when it's like AI co-living with human. So the first question I'm curious is like you started from gaming and you use a lot
Mhm.
of mind technology there.
Yeah.
How do you decide to broaden up to like generic consumer sector and empowering other consumer startups?
Yeah, so I'll tell you the full story. So basically, because as I alluded to, so when I was at DeepMind, after the GPT-3 launch, there was a kind of big push to figure out how we bring generative models into different Google products. And so, we had very cool early conversations around what search would look like, when it was AI native, which took until Google I/O this year to actually happen. What would YouTube, learning, all these different areas. And what ended up happening was so much of our work ended up in certain Google Cloud applications, things like contact centers and certain professional facing applications. And I have continued to kind of see that momentum, continuing. So, you see most of the big AI companies that you see are professional facing or are developer tools themselves. If you look at the App Store, though, there's very few new companies on there that have actually created something AI native. Like ChatGPT for sure is on the top there, but there's very few. Like if you look at the top 100 list, it's not that dissimilar from what it was, 10 years ago or 5 years ago. Um, and so when we first started out, we recognized based on those learnings from DeepMind and Google that conversational AI was clearly something that the current generation of models were really good at. And so we were looking at that, the capabilities of the model, as well as kind of the growing space here in gaming and media. And so we just started basically like, well, there's a very clear gap there, which is, whether there's these virtual worlds. This was just before Meta did their announcement. You have this idea of these characters in metaverse, of course, which had become a dirty word, but the metaverse. And of course, in gaming itself, anybody who's played a game realizes that there's a lot more life that can be brought there. Like of course, the fidelity and graphics and everything else have evolved. And so, yeah, we started working with, Xbox, Disney, Nvidia, Niantic, all these different groups to figure out basically how to build these applications. And the reason it was such a good place to start is one, games have some of the highest technical and creative bars that you can imagine. Everything's got to be happening in, under 500 milliseconds. You've got to have super low cost because you have a lot of users. You've got to be integrated with a bunch of systems. You've got to make a lot of stuff run on device. And so it kind of like, let's say, sharpened our tools a lot. And then we kind of helped to kind of pioneer, I think, a lot of the ideas of even how player-facing AI would feel in games. And so the transition came is like as we were working with these large category leaders in gaming and media, we built actually the core infrastructure for ourselves to kind of accelerate our work with them. And that was mainly just built as internal tooling that we had initially, built to kind of accelerate our own work. But then we started getting inbound from a lot of other broader consumer applications, health, fitness, language learning, and broader groups. And what we realized is kind of the infrastructure that we built to serve our own problems basically solve the same problems that all the other consumer builders were facing. And so those were kind of that was kind of the aha moment for us, was when we were like, oh, well, we have this, we had a prior generation of products that were very focused on gaming. Actually, the infrastructure that we built was the most valuable thing. And that was because it solved like the three core problems, at least, that we see kind of blocking consumer AI adoption today. So the first is like the gap between prototype to production. You can stand up a demo very quickly. Everybody knows that they can vibe code something over a weekend, but getting that to get like ready to manage performance at like multi-million user scale is super hard. So you'd build a prototype in a week, and then you spend 6 months basically actually getting it ready for production. And that kind of pace kills a lot of projects. And so we, of course, faced that, but we saw that also in a lot of consumer-facing applications. The next one is how much resource allocation are you actually putting into net new product development? So what we saw is when teams go through a launch, and I've also talked to other groups, early mobile games and that, places like Zynga, where after they went through a launch, almost the entire team for the next 6 months was on like bug fixes and maintenance, which kind of pulls you away from that new product development. And so we wanted to figure out a way to basically automate a lot of the maintenance and updates so that you could push that time onto net new product development. And then the third one was this idea of experimentation. So games are very interesting because you have two different approaches to games. You have the mobile games, which are very experimental. If you talk to anyone who's doing anything in the mobile space, like things like Candy Crush, they're hyper focused on personalization and they run tons of experiments. When you talk to people in kind of the AAA space, it's much more monolithic. They do a single launch and it's locked in at a certain date. So there's much less opportunity for experimentation. And so we worked with a lot of those bigger partners to kind of introduce that idea of experimentation. But of course, that's something that's super valuable. And we can talk about, your experience there on personalization and consumer apps and how much like experiments that needs. And so we also designed a way to be able to launch and scale hundreds of experiments in parallel without doing code changes. Because if you have to go through a code change for every experiment, you're waiting weeks between each one. So that's kind of like the problems that we saw, that we were facing, but also broader consumer AI builders are facing, which basically pushed us to productionize our internal infrastructure as a new product, which we're launching today.
Yeah, cool. That's really interesting. Maybe let me add a bit about my background, since we actually talked in AGI House briefly, but I never really introduced what I'm doing, why I'm like actually interested in consumer. Actually, I was also from Google DeepMind. At that time, it's called Google Brain. 2016, I was Stanford AI PhD. I was actually the first math PhD who studied like deep learning and decided, okay, I want to understand what's the math behind deep learning. And unfortunately, today I don't understand fully what's the math behind deep learning, but I stumbled upon, the discovery of transformer in 2016 summer, where we find like a self-attention is actually better than bidirectional LSTM sequence models. And I'm the first person who get that like a self-attention model to work on question. Basically just replace like English to French translation into a question plus context as the input and the answer as the output. That's like my first stumble onto like a consumer stuff AI. And I built this AI stuff and realized, okay, if I cheat by like instead of only like fighting the benchmark with Wikipedia, if I just continuously adding the infinite basically Google like a consumer user search query data on like the Google inner like search database, I can basically scale crazy and without changing a single line of the model code, like by increased data size, the performance is like crazy good, because like Google has such good data on like everyone's search and like knowledge queries. And that's the first time I see the power of kind of this like consumer attention market that like Google was basically monopolizing. And over there, I first of all realized, okay, as if I want to do a startup, I'll probably not do anything in consumer space. It's kind of scary how much data Google actually owns about each user. Yeah. Second is I realized, okay, as a mathematician, it's actually not very feasible to use like a mathematical series to understand the deep learning, since it's fundamentally a very empirical science. Just we jump on to use model to do some application. So I spent a lot of time in like financial space. I did like a lot of algo trading, which is kind of like a gameplay in this very abstract, like multiplayer game fashion that people just want to beat each other on, like predicting the market and predicting other events. And it's like a very high stake gambling game that people just like play millions of dollars on like ideations and on like market movements. And it's also very multimodal, right? Like every agent is pretty much like an RL agent that maximizes their reward subject to a bunch of like probabilistic constraints. And it's something that you cannot even build a perfect simulator with, because like there is counterfactual things, but there is also effect that you cannot model. Like when one market maker trades a lot, so it will trigger other market makers to react to it. There's a lot of this interesting kind of effect. So it's in effect for like a professional players, a very big game. And I've been playing that after PhD for 3 years. I managed around $1 billion. And then, of course, I see ChatGPT. And at that moment, I realized, okay, what we did in research is now crossing the bar to like be applicable for consumer. But I don't know what to build. So for the first year when I leave and do startup, I built this company, Generative Alpha. So Gen Alpha is basically a trading AI company where my mission is to build basically the best agentic trading system that combines the best of like quant trading and the best of like the human traders like Soros, Ray Dalio, and like basically mimic how they make decisions, which is massively different from the quant trading models. And so far we have getting pretty good return in the real world NASDAQ gambling game. I've been making 100% return up myself.
Wow.
Like over the last probably 9 months. So like decent in terms of the performance outcome. And that company I'm now like also building this kind of, you can call it like a very abstract game engine, but it's more like I build a money system and exchange for like future of agents. Imagine you can essentially interact with a abstract exchange in like your cloud code, where you can tell it basically vibe coding and tell it to move money from some exchange to on-chain to like some interactive broker or like Goldman's primary broker account. That's the thing we are working on. Essentially, give every retail the capability of like play like a Citadel portfolio manager. And fast forward in like when I do that company for a year, the first thing we build is analyst AI. So I kind of use the analyst AI to essentially build something more like a deep research version of Perplexity that is more focused on finance and do like a deep question on finance. And I realized, oh, consumer is so hard. When I look at what Perplexity do, I was like, wow, it's all about customer acquisition, and it's all about like there's like experiments, like this basically understanding what consumer wants, and like in real world, the most expensive thing is basically attention, traffic, eyeball, right? And the channels, all these channels are crazy expensive. And then it leads me to have this idea about Ping AI, where let's like be hyper personalized and enable everyone to basically basically create a self-custody data wallet that pull over all of their data from different big techs like Google, Facebook to themselves, and build the version of like data in today's world more like everyone's personal MCP about themselves in like all different dimensions about how they trade, how they eat, like what kind of shopping behavior they are, and all this, so that we fully understand this user. And I also spent a lot of time thinking about how we can enable every personal agent to interact in a gaming world. That's why when we talk in AGI House, I was immediately pretty hyped about what Inworld and I was like, okay, if we plug this, we know user very well. We have like luckily the trust from user to have like personal data. And if we can have this like game engine style multiplayer world, it's easy to imagine we might enter the next phase of like how human and AI co-live beyond this. Like trading system is today's like an example of like human and AI co-live, right? Like go to Nasdaq, a lot of your trading counterparty is already algos that do not belong to some human. Yeah, but in the real world where like consumers have fun, all the world is kind of like designed for real person, right? There is like a Cloudflare that try to like basically ban agents from like interacting with these apps, and the whole like advertisement system, no matter impression ads or conversion ads, is all geared towards a human eyeball. But I believe in the future it's going to be like either human eyeball or personal agent, or even some agent that do not belong to some person. And in that world, I can totally imagine there is a base infrastructure that is kind of very similar to a massive multiplayer game simulation engine today.
Yeah. So it's interesting when you think about like kind of to your point there, like consumer is hard. And we kind of maybe like what you also said about Google is interesting, which is like I think people have kind of accepted that consumer is hard. Like even if you talk to a lot of investors on that, people have been kind of scared to step into this space. And what I think is changing right now though is you have a lot of these companies who have been around for a very long time in consumer. If you know your top ones, you've got your top language learning apps like Duolingo, you got your top fitness apps like Strava. You've got basically your category leaders haven't changed a lot. And I know we can see, for example, of course, Spotify, Duolingo, all these companies are trying to shift towards a more AI native approach. And a lot of them actually have, a background in that. So I think there is a question of like, how quickly can they move to properly re-platform into becoming AI leaders? Like that's a general interesting question. The other one is like, okay, what is that open space that exists today for net new consumer founders? So I think we're at a specific moment now where because of the cost that LLMs are at, that generally it costs to serve the infrastructure that we have, like it's actually the finally good moment to build consumer facing AI. And I think there's an opportunity there to like disrupt a lot of the existing ways of patterns of user behavior. So for example, what does an AI native fitness app look like? What does an AI native language learning app look like? It probably doesn't mean just plugging in an AI feature into an existing app. It means reimagining that entire app from the ground up. Like that's what we see, for example, Status by Wishroll, which is one of our customers, and they created this AI Twitter clone where you basically role play as a character in another universe of Twitter. Like they imagine social media backwards from AI. So they said, okay, we know that AI is able to kind of like what's the problem when you jump into Twitter and you don't have a lot of following in that? It's not a lot of fun. So we're going to basically make everyone feel like the star of the show, and AI can make that possible. So they took what was possible with AI and they made a whole new app around it. So I can talk through kind of though, I think like the general question of like, why are people not building these things? So, and this can also kind of bridge maybe to like what we've been building at Inworld. So the first thing is that we found that like most people today at least start with vibe coding or some kind of, IDE. So you can stand up it's really easy to build something that looks like a consumer app, especially browser based, right? Like you can vibe code it in seconds really, or, depending on how fast your model is. But then getting that ready when you're going from 10 test users to 10 million users, a lot of things break in that boundary. And so what we realized was that we needed to have a way to architect these model graphs that would auto scale up as you kind of engage more users. Because basically what you don't want is to have to rewrite your code when you go from 10 to 1,000 to 10,000 to a million users. You want to basically maintain the same code so you can move on to other stuff. And so we built basically a graph system that's a C++ based system that actually uses adaptive graphs. So each node is pre-built with things like LLM, text to speech, speech to text. You can use any provider, but what we set it up to do is so that basically each node auto manages scale. So that as you scale up from 10 to 10,000 users, you are basically ensuring that you're maintaining the latency and performance. You're minimizing cost. You're handling any rate limits or failovers, so that effectively there's no difference there's minimal difference, let's say, in the code going from 10 to 10 million users. And that was kind of one of the core things that we found, is because what we want is for consumer builders to be able to vibe code stuff that is really cool, but then actually be able to launch it. And right now, I think we're at this point where like you can build an app for yourself. You can't build an app for 10 million users, using whatever your cursor is. And so that's, I think, where we wanted to get to, because how cool would it be if I could actually vibe code something over the weekend, ship it, and it tops the app store list? right now there's like an infrastructure problem making that actually possible.
Yeah, I can totally see it. Actually, yeah, like we launched a product like with PNI and also with the Gen Alpha like trading opportunity discovery agent together with it that like launched in Telegram, and we
Mhm.
like it's the first time in my life that I actually saw those like exponential growth curve like
Yeah,
very quickly gets to like a 100K, few 100Ks, and now it's like at a 1 million monthly active user and like a 3 to 4 million user range. It's still in the early phase that our engineers, which is a very lean and small team, can
yeah,
handle. But I'm kind of scared. Okay, obviously AWS and all that has auto scaling, but our engineer have not like been trained to handle the massive traffic. And
yeah,
yeah, like when I build, for example, the trading opportunity discovery agent is literally me plus one engineer with a
yeah,
week with like a bunch of like a simple prompt engineering plus like some like backtest thoughts on like how to cluster historical like tradable events, like very simple stuff, right? So I was just like, okay, how can we optimize all this? And yeah, also like if things goes wrong, like yeah, it like millions of people are relying on it. I don't want to like fail people, right? And
yeah,
also like the cost without optimization gets scary. I have run into those like 100K level of sell like
yeah.
bills. It's like a kind of very scary. I just launched this naive like web-based stuff and it gives me 100K
Yes,
like
that's
bill around
and
myself.
that's exactly like that's a common thing. So like we've seen multiple apps who they launched and they didn't do any optimization. So they were then realizing it was like $15 per user per day. And you're like, oh crap, if I keep scaling this to a million users, I'm gonna have a $15 million bill every day. And so there's a cost factor there. And then the other thing is like if you have a small team, you don't want to have all of them on like cloud optimization and maintenance. Like that's not a very good use of the team's effort. Um, and that actually inspired another thing that we introduced with runtime. So, as we noted, this is something we built for ourselves, but we realized that like we had the same problem, which was basically so many of our engineers were having to figure out the intricacies of all the cloud and everything else. And of course, we have people on our team who should do that and are building a system, but not every engineer should worry about that. And so we basically automated and created automated ML ops. So that effectively means that all the ways that you're capturing telemetry, understanding all the kind of bugs, traces, or errors, you're kind of making sure that you're capturing all of that, which is the first thing that we realized is very important. So just making sure that you're capturing all the content. Then basically being able to auto manage, for example, when you need to push it to a new provider because that provider is running into a rate limit. When you basically, if you're hosting a custom model, when you need to spin up a new, node in a cloud, those aren't things that necessarily like any engineer wants to be able to set up. You just want to deploy your app and then have those things automated. And then we found that like, especially most consumer facing teams, like you're not going to have a huge ML infrastructure team. At least, most aren't for a while. And so being able to automate that is really important. But then the other thing that we realized is like people still want to have visibility and control. So we basically set it up so that while it's having all the automation, you still can view all the logs and traces and information in our portal. And that gives you kind of that visibility. So you can go in and say, okay, actually, I'm noticing that there's a latency spike in this area. And generally, like I need to go in and basically solve that issue. Or, for example, I'm noticing that we're reducing user engagement in this specific geography. Maybe my team needs to go in and look at the features. So it kind of helps you kind of offload a lot of the core maintenance, but then get more insights so that you can kind of actually allocate that to like where you need to put your attention for new product development.
Yeah. That's totally like I think I was just searching for something similar for like kind of consumer behavior hooks to try to understand, okay, like what are our user actually doing?
Mm-hmm.
A lot of times I was trying to say, okay, we have a trading opportunity discovery agent, but I didn't really add the button to trade, right? Like, okay, so what do people do? Like, I really want to know, like, do they like see all this trading opportunity and they open Binance or they like go on chain or like yeah, like if I decide to monetize the attention, like how should I actually do it? And what are the type of users they are? Like, are they more like an on-chain user, or are they more like a centralized exchange user, or more like a stock trader user, but also interested in crypto, or like it's all
Yeah,
this
yeah, yeah.
I want
And
to
every person, then like that's that kind of is a good bleed to the next point, which is like every user requires something different. And the crazy part about consumers is you never know what they like. Like you could sit down for a month in a dark room and try and guess, what's going to most engage users, and you're probably going to be wrong every time. You just need to put things into the wild and then see what happens. And this was basically one of our biggest learnings was kind of as we mentioned, right? Games, at least large games, have this kind of very monolithic launch cycle where they build one thing once, they launch it, and then they move on. And that's very scary when you're thinking about AI because you're like, I don't know what model or prompt or structure is going to most engage users. So I need to just run lots of experiments. And so, that is like we designed this whole system to allow us to basically stand up lots of variants. So you basically have your model graph, let's say it's a very simple one of speech to text, LLM, knowledge, memory, safety, and text to speech at the end. And then you basically want to figure out, okay, I can use different models for each of those. I can use different prompts for each of those. Slight tweaks, even like changes in just basic configuration settings, might change the engagement of users. So you want to try a bunch of those, push them out each to a certain set of traffic, see which ones go well, and then scale it up. And because of the current restrictions, basically with having to push code changes for each variant, we were being stunted in basically our ability to move fast on those optimizations. So what we wanted to figure out was a way to say, how can we allow for all these experiments to be designed and run without pushing code changes and kind of abstract that out. And so we designed this kind of ability to have live experiments, which means that you can push variants and scale them up without doing any code changes. And the great thing about that as well is when you have a live app, you probably know this, but like when you have to push something to the app store, you have to go through a re-review. And so what you also want to be able to do is push a lot of those changes without doing an app store re-review. And so what that means is you just build the variants into the app, then you kind of have this control panel at the back end. And that allows you to test out tons of different variants of the UI, features, AI pipelines, without actually having to do a app store re-review, which like people don't even think about until they have an app. And then it gets really annoying when any code change or app change actually gets stunted by a couple weeks because you have to push those changes. So we just designed this way, which we call live experiments, to be able to basically run and test all these things in the actual wild.
Yeah, this is very cool. I think basically what you are doing is abstract ways of more like a traditional web and like a mobile development with more like the AI development, the context engineering, like prompt engineering, and also the infrastructure rewire, like using a bunch of like sub agents for each thing, right?
Yes.
Like, essentially, it's like the separation makes essentially your frame is like ChatGPT's front face. It like upgrades very rarely, but then you may upgrade the core, right?
That's exactly right. And like people who have been building in mobile for a long time, you hear them, they just talk, their whole mind is in terms of metrics. Like we made this tiny change, we moved this one thing this much and it updated, by 0.25%, but that's enough for us to push the change. And what's interesting with AI is like, because it's a new thing, people got very used to just like this okay, I'm going to design the specific pipeline, these specific models, I'm going to do a bunch of tests. And so, yeah, we basically wanted to make the same way that we do mobile development and do all that experimentation, make that possible with AI. Because actually, like updating a model can have a much bigger impact than just changing a piece of UI. But you also need to test that. And so that's kind of this interesting thing is like people are like, oh, I'm just going to move everything on GPT-5. Well, that could fix your issues. Or you might actually want to try out all the different models, see which one most engages users, also at the best cost, and then roll that out.
Yeah, this is very interesting. I remember there was a period when character AI was just bought by Google, or about to be bought by Google, where they basically take out all the NSFW side of model, make it super safe. And a lot of people on Reddit is complaining, oh, I just lost my
yes, I remember that.
I just had a brain surgery. Not that, right? So like, and I'm also like a good friend with a bunch of people that do this like chat, like intense like role play chat product.
Yeah.
They were very, very data driven. Like a lot of them come from a quant trading background or like a consumer product background, and they were like very data driven. Okay, this is our CAC. If we spend $1 here, like in the 1.5 year, or make the money back, and if we like swap the model to the other model with like 10% traffic, this is what we observe. People are already very scientific about it, and the early guys kind of build this infrastructure themselves. And it seems you are taking on the approach that the later guys like us would not need to do that, right?
That's the goal for sure. And I like that example too, because yeah, it's interesting. Like I would argue that because ChatGPT kind of defined this chat interface as one of the only form factors, almost everything that people have created after that, I'd say is some variant of ChatGPT, like chatbots, right? That's why all these AI companions and chat apps, I think, do really well, because people have almost this product market fit found there. People like that for some reason. And so I think that like a lot of those are the best examples that we have to date of live apps that have this AI in the back end. And it's interesting that you mentioned how scientific, because I agree. Like when I talk to anybody at Character AI or any of these groups, they are very, very focused on the specific metrics. And when you start to think about it through that lens, it means like you kind of step back from like this very highly intuitive, creative lens, and you say, okay, I don't know what's going to best engage my users. I'm just going to try out lots of things, see what works, and basically just follow the numbers. And it, it's funny that you mentioned because everybody comes from a quant trading background, because that is interesting. Like you're basically doing something very similar, and I hope at the end of the day people can actually operate apps like that as well. And then you also, of course, have teams who are doing the user-facing work, the creative. But when you kind of abstract those two away, it gives you kind of the technical people can do the optimizations on the models and everything else. Product and creative people can do optimizations on the user interface and the visualizations and that. And then when you pair them together and you start thinking about the cross section between those two in some matrix, then you're like, okay, great. This UI with this AI backend works really well, but this UI with this AI backend works really badly. And I think that's basically just how apps will evolve into the future, because it used to be that you had a lot more static content. And so you kind of just refine around that. So when you're adding in dynamic content, now you get this very interesting matrix of like what drives the most engagement.
Yeah. I guess one thing I'm really curious about is how many interesting like multiplayer human AI co-living like consumer use cases that actually take off. We talk about status, right? It's amazing last time in AGI House how that works. And I wonder like if you can share a few more like interesting observations.
Yeah. So we have some very large like media companies, IP owner companies that I can't mention the names of, but there's a lot of really cool stuff in there. For example, around games that are based on IP that self-generate themselves. So you basically can generate the entire world, you generate the missions, you generate everything else, and it basically places the player kind of in a core role there. So there's stuff like that. There's other that are working on like full city scale simulations, like literally replicating realistic world cities. Super cool stuff. On ones that I can also talk about. So these are cool ones like Nanobit, for example, which is it's a mobile developer. They create these interactive novels. They are very interesting because people, these kind of interactive novels have become very popular. So they'd be able to kind of click through a story. And what they realized was they could build content. So they would basically build a single episode for 30 days or 90 days, and then people would consume it in 20 minutes. And so there was this huge gap, and they realized that like their core thing they needed to drive was long-term retention, which means you constantly have to have new content. But if it takes you 90 days to create the new content, you're always going to be falling behind what your users are kind of consuming. And so then they introduced these chat characters, basically characters based on the ones that were in the stories, and made it so that when you finish the story, you could basically just go off and talk to them. And they saw like a boost in engagement off of that. So that's a cool one, I think, where you see kind of existing form factors being revolutionized through AI. Streamlabs is another really cool one. So they're building this multimodal streaming assistant. So imagine you have a game stream, you have the game ongoing, you have your streamer in one corner, and you've got an agent in the other corner. And the streamer can talk to the agent, but the agent can also understand what's happening in the game via visuals. It can also understand what's happening in the chat. And so it's actually able to respond to the game, to the chat, and everything in real time. Our challenge with working with them was like, it needed to be super fast. Like it needs to be able to do all of that with like 500 millisecond latency. Because if you're streaming Fortnite, it needs to respond to everything super, super fast. So that was actually one of the biggest challenges. So we worked with them and NVIDIA on that. And that was like a very cool project. And then just some other smaller ones that I think are really cool in terms of what they're showing. So Little Umbrella, for example, the company that they create these social party games. So Death by AI was their first one, which people may know, and Last Show was their latest one. And in that context, it's like a Jackbox style party game. So you have all your friends join the same room. It's basically a game show facilitated through AI. And that I think is a really cool one as well, because what I've seen is some of the coolest applications I've seen of AI is you just put ChatGPT down on the table and you ask it, facilitate, a question and answer with these 10 people around the table. And it kind of is able to do that actually fairly effectively. And so the Little Umbrella guys basically defined this new version of AI native party game with really cool visuals and engaging. And it's super funny. So I love that one as well. So those are a few examples that come to mind for sure.
Yeah. I think there is one that I imagined, which is very similar to status. Like, can we create like a AI and human co-living kind of DM experience, like WeChat? Right? WeChat is basically the operating system for all like Chinese. It is much more like I guess engaging than Twitter plus Facebook plus a lot of other product altogether. And was imagining, okay, what if a lot of the like WeChat agent is actually AI, and some of them is human, and I can create these WeChat groups and just talk to them jointly. And
I mean, and I think there's a very interesting learning that I've seen with status and across all these apps, which is if you take form factors that people are already familiar with. So, for example, everybody spends most of their time on a computer and social media on their phone. And so when you take that and you take a form factor that people are already familiar with, and then you layer AI onto it, it feels familiar, but then it has this like new level of engagement to it. So you could basically take that across anything, right? Like people are trying to create the AI native Netflix. People are trying to create the AI native, Twitter, obviously, which is what status is. But like, yeah, what does the AI native WeChat look like? So now, you basically could have your agent in your family chat or whatever, and it could respond to things. Or, you could also have a separate family chat that's like maybe the family that you wanted that's on there. I don't know if that's a good idea. But I do think there's a generally interesting question, which is if you just took the top like 20 apps by time spent in the world and you reimagine an AI native version of them, but kept the same form factor, I think you just have 20 top hits on your hands, because each one is going to probably be better than the one, in the kind of static version. And you can just naturally layer in a bunch of really cool stuff. So I think that's like where I often push founders is like, what does a AI native version of an app that you use every day look like? Because people often are just so used to using things that they don't even think in those terms.
Yeah, I guess one thing about like the last generation of consumer product is there is a big network effect, right? When you scale up products, as there is more users, every user gets marginally more utility. That's why it's so defensible. With AI, it kind of is like reducing some of that, because even if you are the only person in the game, like in status, you can create a chat room with a bunch of friends, but you can also play with all AI. It's kind of like when you play like those like WW3 games where you just play with like a crazy level, like a computer when you are bored at home, or you just like play with your friends. I wonder, do you see slowly there is some kind of Turing test that, if you play in this virtual world, you were not able to tell whether you actually are playing with your friends?
That's a good question. I mean, and it's an interesting point on the network effects, because I see actually a lot of companies looking at the question of how can I create network effects in a native experience. I was having a conversation with the folks from Status and then folks from Character AI, and everybody kind of has this view that like people have decided that AI is a single player experience. So like for some reason we've decided that it's this very intimate thing that we do, this one-to-one. Maybe it's how people use ChatGPT. So getting them to then use it in a network effect, right? Like Character AI, Status, they have group features. But they didn't get, I don't think they got as much engagement necessarily as the standalone single player features. So that's interesting. So, I think there is a question that you're asking there, which is like, what does it take for these companies to actually create those network effects to actually take off? And I think it kind of imagines like a little bit of like a new form factor. Like I think, for example, what people are trying to do is you kind of combine TikTok, which is very, network effects oriented, with something like Character AI that's very kind of, personal one-to-one oriented. And what does the merge of those two look together?
Yeah, I think TikTok is kind of like a buy-side network, right? One side is our creators, the other side is our consumer. The consumer of the content do not exactly engage with another consumer, except they probably make comments below it. It's kind of this bipart graph topology, where WeChat is like everyone is pretty much have a clique of friends that they overlap cliques. I think potentially, like TikTok might be an easier product to build if we have this like very good content creation capability, right? If you imagine there is like a Vue 5 style Vue 3 plus like a Genie, like a I kind of imagine it's possible to build like good enough content to consume by human, where the creator is our AI and the human just like a co-class. content.
That's interesting because I think there's a what all of these networks struggle with at some point, and what you see, for example, them all tend towards is you have a increasing concentration of a fewer number of creators that everybody's viewing, and then you have like a broader, and then so for example, when TikTok first starts or Instagram first starts, it's really about getting your friends and sharing, and it's more about kind of the social connection, and then over time, just due to the monetization dynamics, I think as well, you tend to see Mr. Beast is huge, right? You've got your I don't know TikTok very well, but you got your favorite TikTok creators, and they kind of grow in size. But it means that like everyone is just a consumer. Like that's mainly so. There's an interesting question that I think you're pointing at, which is like imagine an AI native version of these content where either a the content was natively just generated by AI and you tested out what's worked and you scale it up, or b it became much easier to create the content. And so like even in status, that's a little bit of how it works is like, you go in and you're role playing as a character, but you get all these responses from everybody else. So it feels like you're kind of what you're really doing is giving someone the sense of their magic in terms of their effect on it. Um, but yeah, I think that's it. Like how you facilitate like human feedback to AI. I mean, Midjourney, I think, was kind of the pioneers there as well, and how you actually use that to improve the AI is really important because to our earlier points on personalization, the more that you're just getting that end user engagement with the content, you're just going to make the content better. And we've already seen, for example, like there's a lot of AI generated videos now that are becoming very viral because they look very real. And I imagine at some point we're just going to have people like mining for really interesting AI content, but I don't yet know what the actual consumer form factor looks like around that.
Yeah. I guess I have been also thinking about this a lot, and one thing I often ask myself is decompose. First, the modality, right? Like, is it gonna be text based, or is it gonna be speech based, or is it gonna be
Yeah.
image like Midjourney, or is it gonna be video, or is it gonna be like an interactive game? My conclusion is like when you put the line around video, like everything simpler than video, like text, speech, and image, it seems the AI creator quality is on par with the
Yep.
mediocre human creators. And when you come to video, even if it's View 3, it still feels pretty far from a top like a YouTube content creator. Yeah, like, and the game is even like if you play like the best like for example NBA like 2K6 or something, the graphics, the like thing is very far from you actually watch the real NBA, right? There is still a very big gap there. So I was thinking maybe everything that might work should work with the kind of things that kind of have already crossed the uncanny valley.
Yeah. Yeah. That's an interesting point. And what I've also found is like people get very caught up in fidelity. So very often people will say, "Oh, this isn't doesn't look as realistic as a real video, so people won't engage with it." Or this isn't exactly a realistic text or image, so people won't engage with it. But what you even find, like if you look at a lot of the most popular mobile games, they're not realistic. They're extremely abstract. They're extremely simple. Like imagine like Angry Birds, like they're very simple in mechanics and they take off. And so I think there's also just this is why I think the idea of experimentation is so important because you don't necessarily know what's going to engage your users best. And so you really want to be able to just test out very simple mechanics. And I often see people kind of like stopping themselves and saying, "Oh, I can't release this because it doesn't look perfect," or "Oh, the voices are not quite there, so I'm not going to release it." My honest answer is just release it to some test users and see, because you might be surprised. Like the voices that everybody uses on TikTok for the voiceovers do not sound realistic, but people love them. They love this like robotic kind of voice. And so it's really hard to predict sometimes what's going to actually take off in the consumer space. And like my honest answer when I talk to groups, they're like, just don't, instead of trying to perfect it, just put out what you currently have, see what people like, see what people don't like, and then iterate from there. And I think that's just scary though, because that's a different way of working than we got used to, which is just like you build the perfect thing and you launch it, and but that's never a good approach, I think, to building a great product.
Yeah. Especially your product requires other like players to participate, right? Like I feel like
Yeah.
more and more AI product also becomes the point. For example, Midjourney, it's like a co-created by this tasteful artist community that use 4choose1 as kind of RLHF to get their style quite different from like Stable Diffusion, from like
Yeah.
GPO and all that, right? Like somehow there is a concept of like community co-creating AI model. In those scenarios, it seems you you ship, and then like you need
Yeah.
to attract the right amount of people. I guess from that angle, have you saw anything in like, for example, voice space that mimics the success of either the character AI or the Mid Journey, that it's like shaping this consumer?
Yeah, so it's interesting because we released our text to speech last month, and so we've been actually engaging a lot more conversations on this. And like, at least as of Friday, we were top of the Hugging Face TTS chart, which is great. So we've been getting a lot more engagement there, and so we've been talking to a ton of groups. And the interesting thing with voice is a lot of groups have been very coy or shy to actually introduce voice AI because it's really expensive. So if you look at the general cost across the pipeline of different models, like text to speech tends to be the most expensive. And so what I've often seen happen is a lot of groups launch features like talking to character AI, or like even thinking with status or Bible chat or other groups that we've worked with. And they basically introduce these voice features, and then they have to turn them down, or they have to hide them behind their paid users or do something because it's too expensive. So my honest answer there is like, I don't think there's been enough experimentation because it's been so expensive. But what I've seen, for example, from a lot of the like companion-oriented AI apps is there's two different modes. So for example, like you just have text over, so you can, or voiceover, like you can take any content in the app and you can click play, right? So like, you can basically just turn it into voice content. Generally, people tend to just have preferences around consuming things as voice or text. And so adding the ability to just have anything spoken by a voice that you like actually is a very simple way to add voice into an app. So just imagine you have your Twitter feed, or you have any other feed, and at any given point you can click, I just want to listen to it. That's a very simple change that can actually be introduced to any app that increases the accessibility of it, that increases the engagement. So that's a very simple one. The next one is like adding real-time chat or real-time voice. So that's basically if it's a character-based app, or if you're talking to a company or something, just adding that ability. Okay, I want to jump on a call. So you could, similar to how we're talking right now, and you can jump on a call. And then the last one is like what I would call like a synthesized conversation. So that's where you have the podcast, for example, between two people. So we've had some very cool conversations with like large AAA gaming companies who are basically like, imagine you have a game, and then after you finish a session, it generates a podcast with your favorite podcasters discussing your last playthrough. And so that's really cool because like people are very used to consuming podcasts or consuming different content. And that adds the ability to then have it kind of like, but focused on what you care about. Or even actually at the hackathon, I don't know if you remember this, the winners of our AGI House hackathon, they were basically using a similar thing where they generated a custom podcast for you every morning. So you selected the topics that you wanted to listen to, the podcast that you liked, to generate a custom podcast. So I guess those are the three kind of ways that I've seen people using voice. So first of all is just like voiceover of existing content. The second one is basically having that real-time chat. And the third is doing synthetically generated content that feels like something engaging and is very personalized to you.
Yeah, how about speech to text? I'm actually very interested in speech to text, since I feel like it's almost soft, but there is this last mile is still high in there. And I'm kind of like a Duolingo speaker with like Chinese and English. And when I think and speak really fast, I mean, I can speak English very fast, I can speak Chinese very fast, but a lot of times when I'm talking to AI, like ChatGPT, I actually talk in a mixed way, and the AI kind of understand. But when I use, for example, Apple's like Siri, like this new Apple Intelligence, it's kind of retarded and cannot really understand that I introduced Chinese, and I was like, it seems there is this last mile that is missing. And it's cool, right? I guess the last bit is how can we also add speech to text beyond to add the emotional component, like the text to speech, where you add a character, make it playful.
Yeah, so speech to text, it's a funny one because I've recently in the last week, I found that Apple updated some of their speech to text and a bunch of other apps did. So I've been basically using it actually to write docs and everything else now. So I've actually been, for the last month, I've almost switched over from less typing to more voice annotation. And so sorry. Sorry. So basically over the last month, I started switching over from typing to using more annotation because it just helped me speed up my processing. And so I've definitely felt the pains and also the benefits of speech to text. There's certain things it just doesn't get right, and it's really annoying because then you have to go back in and type when you're already speaking. There's a lot of like proper names and stuff that it doesn't get right. So I think there's an aspect there of just like the quality of the speech to text model, which I believe will get better. Like, I mean, we have Whisper, Voxel just came out from Mistral. There's a few other things that I think people are innovating there. But the other thing is like the turn prediction, for example. There's a lot of other things that make it more realistic. So being able to have interruptions, turn prediction, like part of it is the accuracy of the speech to text, and the rest of it is how well it's understanding what you currently mean. And when you cut it off, how is it able to make content? Like ChatGPT does it very well, but I have not seen a lot of other apps that actually successfully do this. And of course, ChatGPT uses a speech-to-speech model, which makes it a lot easier. The other thing is that when you're using different languages, it doesn't understand pronunciation. It's transcribing it still to a token. And so, like when you are trying to learn Chinese, I literally am trying to learn Chinese right now with the different apps, and it's very hard because it can't correct my pronunciation. It's like, oh, that's perfect. And I'm like, well, no, it wasn't. I know it's not perfect. I know it's not perfect because I can, like, my partner speaks Chinese and I can, she's telling me it's not perfect, but the AI tells me it is. And so I think there's also that issue of like, it's just not understanding phonemes. It's just doing a translation of like a voice recording to text, but it's not actually understanding the specific phonemes in there.
Yeah. I think one thing I was constantly thinking is like I used to do like algo trading, right? And we do this like earning call like lesson model that like lesson to, for example, Jason Huang like give like earning calls. And typically one thing we let our AI do is like try to understand the confidence level. It's actually a very hard task. I let my people build it like 2021, 2022. None of them are successful. I was never able to get signal. Basically, how can you get a CEO saying something not confident and basically feel kind of beaten up?
Interesting.
Right,
Yeah.
like all like oversell and make it super confident. Since this is like very nuanced things, if you can get those speech to almost not only text but like semantic space, style space properly, I feel like it can unlock a lot of new application.
Yeah, we have built with certain client specific models for that, like extracting out emotion, for example, from speech. You usually just use a separate model that's like a classifier on top of the actual raw audio. But it's different, right? Like compared to speech to text, which is actually doing naturally speech to text translation. I do think that's definitely a interesting challenge.
Yeah. It seems people do this as more like a specialization, but if you look at how OpenAI solves like real-time speech, right? After Whisper, they kind of like not really drilling on speech to text, text to speech. They were like, okay, let me turn it into one end-to-end pipe. The speech in, text to speech, like a function call out. And that approach gets very good, and the Grok seems to be able to mimic the like success with the recent Grok 4 launch. Like, have you seen the whole industry kind of going convert to this giant model approach and then maybe distill out of it?
Yeah, I think I always think about the kind of two paths towards whatever AI looks like in the future, as one is like the AI monopoly approach, and the other one is the distributed network approach. So like AI monopoly is basically saying, we believe that the best way to build AI is for a single company to have a fully verticalized stack, all the way from hardware to infrastructure to models to user interface, and then we'll just perfect that. And I think we're kind of seeing the most momentum in that direction, to be honest, right now, because of where the money's going and everything else. But at the same time, like I believe the right answer here, and where you've generally seen technology progress, is like, okay, it's one thing if you say we're going to have like 10,000 people in the world who are the ones innovating on AI versus we're going to make it into a generic tool set and a bunch of people on different companies are solving different parts of that ecosystem. To me, just at the end of the day, because of just the number of people working in the world and also the fact that jobs will change and people need things to do, I think being able to make it so that we're able to use open source models, everybody can use different hardware, that we actually have good inference stacks for every hardware. Because right now, the only thing you can really use in production is NVIDIA. So how do we get AMD and Tenstor and Grok and all these other ones stood up so that we can have different options? How do we have different inference stacks that we can build on that? And these are all different people building these, in my opinion, or it should be. How do you have different people building different models? Open source models, it could be closed source, different ways of doing that. Then you've got, of course, infrastructure like our runtime, which lives on top of that. Then you've got the application builders, and you've got this kind of whole ecosystem of people building. But I think there's kind of a pressure towards like single companies owning that entire stack. And I just fundamentally believe that like the best outcome for everyone long term will be if that is distributed across a bunch of people. And what that requires is like more open models, for example, having more open weight models, having more flexible inference stacks that people can access, having better hardware accessibility and reducing also the price of hardware. Also like consumer like product companies or basically like hardware companies like Apple making it easier for developers to integrate AI onto on device features. Like there's a lot of things that could be done, I think, to make this distributed network approach to AI development more possible. Although I think that the momentum's in the other direction right now.
Yeah, it seems people are still using the SOTA model, right? I think one thing about the SOTA model is there is, in some sense, a multiplayer mode collapse. No matter how much system prompt or context engineering you add and you try to pretend you make a very diverse multi-modality world, in the end, you only have kind of 4 or 5 drivers, maybe like at most
Yeah,
drivers. If you add all the Chinese models and the blah,
yeah,
like European models, even like you add an SFW model, the sensible model on each modality and the function is less than 20. Uh,
yeah.
it's it's pretty hard to actually get things to the point that it's actually mimic the diversity of real life game experience, right? Like for you guys, it seems the biggest problem in like this multiplayer game creation. Like I guess 1 or 2 years ago, you probably already ran into this, right?
Yeah, we always generally start with, so you start with the SOTA models, like wherever you are. So generally we kind of see the approaches. The first thing you want to get to is whatever quality you want. So as we kind of advise folks, it's like build with the most expensive, best possible models you can, just to reach the quality bar that you're happy with. So let's say this was, a language learning app, and you basically wanted to just make it really good. So you're going to build with them, and then it's going to end up being way too expensive and way too slow. So then the next step is to say, okay, how can we replicate that quality that we're happy with by, for example, splitting up a bunch of different prompts and tasks. So often when people use SOTA models, they get used to putting huge context in, they do a single big call. Well, if you split that up to a bunch of smaller calls, they go to smaller models and you do intermediary steps, you can often really reduce price, reduce latency, and increase quality. And so what we often see is people kind of take this, like I would call it like the naive approach to AI development, which is like strap together the strongest models you can and assume it's going to be the best. Well, that might get you to an initial quality bar, but then if you want to start iterating, you need to start splitting out the different prompts and models, basically running a bunch of different evaluations over it, and then figure out your custom model, like your model graph. And then you start testing out the variants on top of that. So then you launch that and you continue to design the experiments and variants. And then at some point you've collected enough data that you can kick off custom model training. And that's where we generally see customers move to. So at a certain point, once you have enough traffic, you can start to train and tune custom models that usually take an open source model, you distill it down, you also kind of train on the specific data, you do alignment on it with RL. And then at that point, you can usually drop costs significantly by like 60%. And so it's a matter of like, how can you get to that first amount of usage where you can start that custom model training, but without kind of going bankrupt, and then quickly kind of shift onto a custom model that's going to reduce your cost per user.
Yeah. I do that a lot myself with like a startup journey mostly, but it's mostly still to me like a cost saving plus distillation from the best model. I was thinking, okay, if I truly want to inject the diversity to like make it feel vastly different, right? It's easy to do, for example, character-based style mimic for like
Yeah.
games. But if you really drill deep down, you find you are talking to the same soul. How can you diversify the amount of soul? Like in real life, like it seems yeah, that requires at least a full fine tuning or something, or like a
Yeah.
full RL
Yeah.
run. And
Yeah, we found like we basically stood up our own cloud for that reason, where we found like customers at a certain point needed to be able to do like full fine tuning and even sometimes like full train, like deeper training of the models, adapter tuning, doing alignment. And then like once you basically get into a loop and you have also the live production metrics coming in, and you can not start doing this fine tuning or evaluations not based on like offline evaluations, but start doing them with online evaluations, then you get a lot better signal, and you can start to also work. Like this is one thing I would also mention is like from the very early days, one of the things that I see consumer builders doing is they don't integrate those feedback features into the application, which is extremely valuable. Like a little thing like a thumbs up or a preference score or a dislike is really helpful when you're doing the downstream fine tuning and reinforcement learning. And so one of the questions I always ask is like, what is the metric that you care most about that you would be able to like, if you had a North Star metric to evaluate the different model graphs, what is that? Because then you can start to kind of build in the better features to capture that. You can make sure that you're, getting enough usage over time, and that's when you can really kick off the effective tuning.
I see. Yeah. In the early days, I remember probably like 1.5 years ago, I asked Andre Kaparsi this problem in one AGI house party. It's like like model's response is so like a kind of monolithic and repetitive. It's like when you carefully feel it, you feel it's the same. So he's more like he found it useful by adding constraints. It's more like in prompt, if you add a diverse set of constraints, somehow by constraints you get to like different corners of a giant model. And I tried a lot of that. I find it kind of work for productivity use case. Somehow it does not get you the like on the killing time, find the fun or find the emotional value type of angle.
Yeah.
Have you seen a mixture of this prompt constraints, context engineering approach?
Yeah, so like the way we designed runtime, so our learning came from the fact that like yes, there's a few things that we think about. So first of all, like you have to have access to lots of different models. So there's often, for example, people will stick within a specific ecosystem. So they'll go to Google or OpenAI or Anthropic and say, okay, I'm going to use some variants of their models. First of all, you've got to start with all of the different closed source models, all of the different open source models, try out basically where you get to in terms of just your first pass without doing any prompt, like special prompt engineering or tuning or anything else. Then you start basically doing prompt optimization. So we have ways of doing automatic prompt optimization. So you kind of set your specific goals, you allow the kind of prompt to self-optimize. And then you start adding in constraints and metrics. So constraints are basically what you don't do. So for example, we see people, these might be things around things that they don't say, certain ways that they don't respond. It also could be technical constraints around like latency or cost, so that you're making sure that you're sticking within those constraints. And then the next thing that you add on is like North Star metrics. So you basically take your models and prompts, you add in your constraints, and then you start fixing them to North Star metrics. And that's when you start running the experiments. You're saying, I need to maintain within these constraints, but then I'm going to kind of make any changes that I can that make an uplift on this North Star metric. And so that like is just turning it into a science problem, really, because the thing that I see with constraints and the way people prompt often is like, don't do this, right? They type into the prompt like, don't do X or Y, which is very hard to actually have like we all know that that's not really how models work now. And so what I often say is like, okay, put your constraints in terms of like a numerical metric that can be measured, and then basically do a test to make sure, whether that's an LLM-based test or, an actual like offline evaluation or an online evaluation. How can you actually ensure that your current models or entire graph are not breaking those constraints? Like you need to run the test to do it. I have to date, I've spent probably hundreds and hundreds of hours interacting with LLMs, and I have never found that like don't do X actually works very reliably. Sometimes it does, but not very reliably. And so, yeah, it's really that matter of decide your model graph, set your constraints, set your North Star metrics, and just run tons of experiments, I think is the right way to figure this out.
Yeah, Actually, I thought about this fun joke that I had with a friend of mine who do like this role play game design for large language model. They were having this kind of like nice experiment since GPT-2, which is like you want to create a character that decides they will never leave the dungeon. It's like you create a dungeon imaginary, you put it, you tell the character you live in the dungeon, and then you let other people tell it. And then you basically want to force it, okay, no matter what happens, you will not leave the dungeon. And by today, I think up to GPT-5, no one is able to build an inherent constraint.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's that's a great test. That's like, this is exactly the type of, because you could imagine also, for example, like in a very enterprise context, like never recommend a competitor. Like something as simple as that. Like you could talk to these customer support, anybody who works in customer support AI is going to tell you like that kind of thing is a big problem. Because if you're doing a deal with Ford and all of a sudden you're recommending Toyotas as the best car, it's a big problem. And so like that kind of idea of like tests for constraints is a really cool one.
Yeah, I remember playing with like I think the OpenAI real-time voice model when it kind of determined they will not give financial advice. So when talking English to it, it like do not give financial advice. So I tried very hard to facilitate it as an analyst AI for me, and then to some point I start asking in Chinese, and then I break the boundaries. Somehow I think there is an external classifier that decides what is financial advice and start to not understanding. And at some point in the middle of the conversation, all of a sudden it stops the financial prediction and decide, okay, I like, and it all of a sudden turned from talking in very natural Chinese to me with like very vivid, stupid 3 years ago English. Oh, I'm not allowed to talk about
That's
it.
hilarious. Yeah, that's really interesting.
Yeah,
Yeah, so I want to just go back and ask you a question as well, because so like one thing we found is like development, the way people are approaching product development is changing a lot, and so even when we were designing runtime in the SDKs, we started well over a year ago now, and even in that time, I'd say most software engineers at that time were like still starting to get onto Cursor and Cloud Code. I mean, I don't think Cloud Code was around then. And it's been shocking to me how much in the last like 6 months, everyone now has some favorite, whether it's an agentic IDE or your whatever you're using. And and so also what it's meant is like as we're designing the SDKs in that, we have to not only think about are they friendly for humans, but are they friendly for AI to work with? Like, and so I'm asking you kind of as a developer, like how has your development process changed in terms of like how much you use these idea, the code assistants, and how that kind of just changes your general development pipeline.
Okay. Yeah, it's actually very interesting. I have like shifted significantly from like a vibe coding with cursor and then like a tab and autocomplete to basically now pretty much no longer type any code and only talk to like Cloud Code and then like 1 2 3 2 2 2 1 1 1 3 why you are wrong and then like 1 2 3. That's kind of like my new paradigm. And when I want to code seriously, I more like talking to my analyst or my like a quant developer. Okay, here is what you need to do. Ship this to me. In the old days, like in Slack, I tell them this is this week's job. You need to do A, B, C, D. Do this 5 experiment. Tell me this. Give me a report. And now I basically instruct AI in a way that they are basically people working for me in Slack. And I think that paradigm is slowly gonna get to layered where my Slack bot will also have their juniors, and they will tell their juniors, okay, this is what you need to do to me. Kind of that agents. I think now some of this happen internally to like I guess ChatGPT deep research and agent mode, but it's not like universally out there. I think that's gonna be one thing. Another thing is I believe human will be freed out. I'm kind of imagining this world where you do not need to code in front of a computer. You just talk to your phone. And I'm kind of building a bit towards this with our stealth mode kind of PI consumer product. That you can just talk to your phone and literally it like hooks up with your Cloud Code and your Cloud Code actually ships for you. So instead of you sitting in front of a computer and work all day, you can basically like sit on a beach or even most aggressively like get on your road bike and then bike on the like wood side while you just like also and look at results. I think
I agree. I mean, it's interesting, right? We've got very used to the fact that working means looking at a computer screen all day. And I think actually this is why I'm excited for their launch of Runtime today is the reason that I think it's still not possible is because you could vibe code, you could talk to Claude Code, it could build something, but there's still not like even the libraries that it's borrowing from aren't necessarily going to work at scale. And so there's like this challenge where like if all of the frameworks and libraries that are just integrated into the app are natively set up to assume that you're vibe coding and then handle all the complexities in the back end to then scale it up, then basically you get to a place where like whether it's via Claude Code, Replit, Lovable, whatever, people can actually just like not only like what you see on a lot of those apps right now is like I built this app for myself, it's really cool, but you don't see a lot of people launching them. Like I want to click it so that in 1 week you can actually stand up that app, you can ship it, it gets shipped to the app store, it's live, and then it basically starts operating it. And that's why I think this like the auto scaling infrastructure that we integrated in all the management of the ML operations should hopefully solve that, because I think that is it. Like, so maybe my goal needs to be that Bill in a couple of years, you can just sit on a beach and talk to your phone and your app's just going to keep updating and improving into the future.
Yeah. And with Gen Alpha, we are building kind of the new concept of like agentic money, which is basically design the stablecoin and the real world US dollar layer that is like most friendly to this like agentic coding tools like Cloud Code and whatever models that can use MCP and use sub agent to basically move money a form of sub agent and make exchange a form of like a multi-agent playground, where in some sense that's like a very abstract version of a game where it's like an exchange kind of like a crypto money, but in some sense,
Yeah.
so like the same way you design like a virtual game, right? And when that happens, I think it's fairly easy to imagine that human will slowly become more like a billionaire LP that are pretty laid back and do very few things, only like basically inject their preference, and
Yep.
people just work for them as like AI GP. And
Yeah, and it's like and this actually comes to another interesting point which we can cover before we wrap, which is around like how monetization and pricing I think is changing as well. So I've had a few conversations both with, model providers, app providers, large public companies and consumer media. And what's interesting is like we have for a long time got pretty far from like pricing and value kind of have become kind of distance. Like it's almost like, hype is what price is. And so it's very hard to distinguish things. With AI, it becomes very easy to measure basically like, you can almost look at it at the token level. What is the user value per token? You basically can, and that almost is like the unit margin that you really care about. And I think that's really interesting because at a certain point, like if you're talking for your AI GP, if you were spending $2,000 on AI compute a day, or let's say $10,000, but you were only making $2,000 a day, that becomes very obvious. In the consumer app, you can think about it in the exact same way, and you already made those parallels between consumer and finance. So if I'm spending, $10,000 on tokens per day, but only making $5,000, well, something's wrong. And so then I would basically look at like at that token level, at that basic level of how much I'm consuming, what is the value that my customers are getting off of that? And I think if everybody unifies to a usage-based business model, which seems to be happening, I think is very good for consumers. It means that we get to a point where like that entire value chain down the stack, from your hardware to your inference to your runtime to your models, everything else, is just a marginal cost per user usage. And then the question for application builders becomes like, how much value am I getting per user per usage? And then it's the economics change a little bit, but it's very different from how like what companies used to do is they used to say, okay, we're going to set up $500 million in budget this year. For that $500 million, we think we're going to make $750 million in revenue. And so, that's going to be our profit. Well, now it's all variable costs. So it's basically a matter of if I create that value, users will use it, and then I'll basically have a cost associated with that. So it's also, I think, changing the way that even like finance and accounting teams are thinking, which means that they need to think more in terms of variable cost and OpEx versus like these large expenditures, and really just focus on like, if I can get one user to find more value than I'm spending for them per day based on my AI operations, that's good. And I think there's something very interesting in there.
Actually, I slightly disagree, since I realized I thought about that too, right? Like Jason Huang is talking about token economy with like his token factory, and this is basically how he want to ship the whole AI world. But then I realized people are still talking to their phone and computers, and the buying eyeballs somehow for consumer app is still a bigger cost. Even for some company fairly large like Perplexity, if you carefully guess how much they spend on like IT costs, including like paying for large language models, self-hosting, versus how much they spend on like to Facebook channels, to like TikTok channels, to like paying for a bunch of interviews, to like having marketing team. I would still guess for company like Perplexity level, it's still like a more cost on like the GTM.
I agree there. I think today for sure it still operates like that. My feeling is more like into the future. So let's say even you built your company, right? Instead of maybe having a bunch of like you doing manually setting up Facebook ads, Google ads and everything else, you had an agent that you said, okay, I'm going to allocate $5,000 to ads today. You're going to figure out how it basically just becomes part of that overall consumption. So it's kind of unifying it all in the back end. But I agree that today, like you basically like your AI cost is separate from your other costs. But at the end of the day, you basically just need to ask the question of, okay, I'm making $5 for this user today. What is all the other costs in the back end before it adds up to that? And at some point, as AI takes over more operations, it's going to basically break down to how much you're consuming to achieve that value. But today, you have to do a bunch of manual stuff as well to kind of get the eyeballs.
Yeah. So I wonder when is a turning point that for a mid-sized consumer app that is say from Series A to like pre-IPO, Yeah, like which is basically when they start have unit economics, right? Like when they have like an initial phase, maybe Series B, when they have an initial phase of PMF and then start to scale. Like
Yeah,
what is a turning point where their large language model and in general IT cost is bigger than their like go to market like mindshare brand building cost. It's
yeah,
only very few products cross that bar, right? Like probably
yeah,
ChatGPT sure cross that bar, Cloud Code cross that bar, but for most other product, I doubt how. It's almost like when you cross that bar, you reach the what I guess Elon has this saying, right? Like from first principle, everything has this bare metal cost. If you were able to build things close to the bare metal cost, you are like better.
yep,
I think somehow for consumer startup, there is also this concept of bare metal cost. If you like a self-hosting open source
hmm
model and fine tune and distill from the frontier model, blah blah blah, so that your hosting cost still becomes the largest content and your attention like and eyeball cost is like negligible comparing to your IT cost.
yeah. No, I really like that. And also, like, at what point does your like marketing cost become more of an engineering problem? Like, because a lot of the point, like growth now, like how you generate ads, how you decide where to allocate them. I feel like someone's got to build a really good company that we can, as founders, basically just say, okay, I'm going to spend this much this week. You figure out how to allocate it. You go find the influencers. If we're going to do that, you're going to set up your ads. I would love that. I'm sure you would love that too. Because that part of it is still painful for sure. So I think that's a whole other problem. I'm not going to solve that one, but someone needs to.
Yeah. But I think that's a pretty. I don't even see that easily being solved because somehow people are kind of greedy, right? Like I think in a lot of scenarios there's like this KL like Twitter, YouTube, or like kind of TikTok influencers that you somehow need to cater to them with this deal by deal kind of things that you pay respect to them and then they like show harder for your product that it's not as mechanical as you just throw ads onto Facebook and it just magically works. For example, Elon as a founder, actually, yeah, I learned a lot from Elon by like one of my investor works for him as the head of FSD, right? Like uh,
Hmm
his investor, so we have like constant sync, and I try to mimic how Elon operate companies. He do not have marketing department. Period. He alone is the only marketing department of the whole company. So he's
Yes.
able to
Yes.
get
Yeah.
users, but it's not somehow something replicable. I at least I'm trying very hard as like a podcast and everything to replicate this, but it's so hard. And I think at some point there's um like a marketing cost is things that become still like a human affection thing that
Yeah.
I don't quite see machine easily overtake.
I don't think it will take over. So I think there's a difference between growth, which is basically paid ads, and that is, I think, automatable for sure. I think in terms of the positioning and messaging and all of those kinds of things that actually help people understand the company, it needs to be personal. And I think you also see like that's why like CEOs tend to be the ones who kind of become the face because people like to associate a company with a person. And so I think there is something there that can never really be lost. Like it feels like it's necessary. Like, NVIDIA is just as much Jensen as it is GPUs.
Yeah,
And that's just the reality of it. So I agree. Maybe that's like when I'm thinking about it, I'm thinking more like paid ads, like that part of it for sure. Mark's always talking about that. That's going to go away. But I think that like that brings back the human element of it. So if all the rest of that stuff is automated, then really what it matters is like who is this person who's like operating all this stuff that I actually believe in, and that is I think really important.
yeah. Yeah, I think we are coming to the end of it, and it's really fun conversation. At last, as a transition of my podcast, I try to ask two questions. One is, what's your most contrarian prediction for the next 1 year and 2 year for like what's going to happen inside the AI, especially like consumer AI space that people would not agree today? And
Mm.
second is, if you were to make a bet, like for example, if you were forced to do another consumer AI company that directly touch consumer in like a gamified fashion, but not like build a game, what application will you build if you were like say this is your new startup journey from today, like
Okay, good questions. So I think on the first one, my most contrarian view, I actually want to start with the second one because I think it kind of bleeds in. So I'll start with the second question. So The thing that I would personally want to build, the thing that I found most interesting, and kind of as we talked about, is AI still kind of sticks us to the screen, right? Like when you're talking ChatGPT, when you're talking to any companion app, when you're engaging anything, the things that I've like personally found is like really fun apps that I've just discovered in the last few years are things like Merlin, which is like a bird watching app. There's Nature ID, which helps you identify plants. These are very cool because like you're just out on a walk, but then your phone enhances your experience in the real world. And the other thing that I've seen is like, Pokemon Go as like a mechanism, right? So Pokemon Go as a way to basically bridge that real world and virtual world content. So I think just a generic app that allows people to basically identify different things in their environment. Basically imagine Pokemon Go combined with bird watching, nature ID, and basically different routes like hiking routes in all trails. But you had your personal concierge. So an AI that is basically going out into the world with you. You could do it on your phone. You could use smart glasses eventually. And it's basically a way to it's answering a simple question of how can I make a 1 hour walk through my neighborhood more interesting? Because everybody has a neighborhood. Everybody goes for walks outside. And I would think that like those haven't changed a lot in the last 100 years. How could I make that more engaging? Sure, some people are going to use Pokemon Go. Most people are not going to use Pokemon Go. Most people can walk around and be like, oh, this is an interesting building. This is an interesting plant. This is an interesting bird. How do you gamify that to incentivize people to collect more? How do you create rewards around that? And the cool thing about that as well is I think like as AI upgrades, like that kind of app could evolve as well, because eventually you'll have real-time video streaming. Then you'll be able to say, okay, I want to see, a different, what would this environment look like right now if it were an apocalypse? Like there's a lot of things that could change. So I almost think like a layer between us and like the real world that can be facilitated through AI. I really believe very strongly that someone's going to build this, whether it's Meta or someone else. Because I think what we've kind of learned a little bit is like that whole metaverse idea and the pure VR space of putting on, a headset and work is not as sexy as like the AR space and kind of bringing things into the real world. So I think there are going to be some apps that really nail that as a form factor. And that's what I think will kind of be one of the bigger forms that we see in the next few years is something that bridges real world and augments very normal things like a walk through the neighborhood.
Yeah.
So that's one idea. I mean, I try not to think about these things too much because I like to not think about myself as an app builder. Because like I very specifically said, Inworld will never build our own apps because we will never compete with our customers. So my more contrarian view is I think that we're going to see that there is a very quick decline in the progress that we're seeing from default models. So even as like GPT-5 comes out, we're going to get Gemini 3, like, Claude 5. What we're going to start seeing is I think the actual impact of the advancement of those models have diminishing returns on consumer facing evaluations. So as we talked about, right, we're going to keep seeing improvements on benchmarks, but I think at some point the translation of those benchmarks into engagement in consumer facing apps is going to go down. And what that means is then people are going to have to get much more creative, because right now I think what happens is every time a new model comes out, people install in their app and the app gets a little bit better. Quickly, I think we're going to see diminishing returns on that, which means that every consumer company that has AI today and is just plugging in, OpenAI's real-time API or GPT-5 is going to have to start thinking a lot more deeply of like, okay, crap, now my app isn't actually getting better. I've got to learn how do I train models? How do I customize prompts? How do I run a bunch of experiments? And so I think there's going to be a shift at some point between the belief that progress is driven by the kind of step changes from the soda models to a need to actually each company having their own models, their own stacks, and being able to innovate that way. Of course, like we'll still get improvements as soda advances, but I do think that's kind of the general trend that I expect. So just to say, I think we've been basically following this trend for the last 2 years, which is like the AI industry moves in these step changes as each new model comes out. I think that will now flatten out over the next year or so, and you'll see a lot of pressure return to companies to figure out, oh crap, how do I build my own models? How do I build my own stack? How do I customize a lot more of this stuff? Because I can't rely on the foundation model companies' advancements anymore to like drive my user engagement. So I think that's semi-contrarian view. Maybe it's more popular though.
Yeah, it's probably more popular these days. I think a lot of app builders and founders, especially come from ML background like us, kind of get bored of like just prompting, context engineering, and swap the UX experience, right? At some point, people want to have a break from the plateau to build some unique modeling perspective. But somehow I thought this will happen a while ago, but then I was blown away by kind of like a Cloud 3.7 series, where I was like, oh, coding actually is this fundamental capability that maybe it will drive all application by like code on the fly and the right tools rather than just developer right tool and AI use tools.
Yeah, it's a very interesting one. So yeah, I mean, this has been great though. I can wrap up, I guess. I should share some things about what's actually coming out today. So yeah, people, the Inworld runtime is now live. It's publicly available. It's really easy to start. You just go and download SDKs. It's also free for August. So we're gonna basically make all usage free for August, which is hopefully fun and people can play around for the next few weeks. And basically it works with all your existing models. So we've designed it. We kind of understand like anybody building a consumer is probably very busy. And so we very specifically designed it to kind of fit on any existing models or structure that you have, and you can wrap it in the Inworld runtime and get the benefits without changing anything. And all your favorite models are available there, like OpenAI and Anthropic and all that. So it's super easy to start with. It's very vibe friendly. We've designed it that way. Even our docs and everything are set up partially for humans, partially for LLMs. Yeah, I'm super excited to see people build with it.
Cool, really excited to try it out in 2 days. Yeah, it's thanks again for coming, and hope you got like a great lunch.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Bill. Nice to talk to you.
Yeah.